I'm Kathleen Olive. Welcome to Limelight Arts Travels podcast, A Closer Look. Guido Reni was one of Italy's superstar artists in the 16th and 17th centuries. Working in Bologna, Rome and Naples, and with a contemporary reputation that stretched well beyond Italy, he commanded some of the highest prices of his day. But today, the appeal of Reni's style and subject matter can be less immediately apparent. In this episode, I'm joined by artist and art historian Dominique Millar, who invites me to take a closer look at Reni's Atalanta and Hippomenes, a carefully composed and brilliantly executed work on a fascinating mythological theme. Dominique, thank you for coming in today, and you're going to introduce a painting to us by Guido Reni.
Thank you, Kathleen. Yes, so we're looking at Atalanta and Hippomenes, a painting by Guido Reni. As you can see, it's a painting which is dominated by two figures. And what we notice here, they appear to be racing one another. This is due to the fact that Atalanta was someone who'd been told by an oracle that if she married, it would greatly endanger her. So to prevent this danger, she set up a race in conjunction with her father, who happened to be a king, that whoever won the race would be able to marry her, but the catch was whoever didn't win the race would be put to death. So we then have Hippomenes here, who has decided to race her. Initially, we have the account in Ovid's Metamorphoses, the great Roman poet, and he recounts that Hippomenes thinks it's absurd to race this woman, but when he sees her, he's struck by her beauty. And what is very fortunate for him, he is actually the great-grandson of the god Neptune. So he has the gods on his side, and he realizes this, so he decides to race her. And he prays to Aphrodite, or Venus, as the Romans call her, the god of love. And she appears to him and gives him three apples. In some versions, it's the apples of the Hesperides that Hercules goes and gets, often associated with the apples in the Garden of Eden, a similar sort of Mediterranean myth. But here, the apples come from Crete. She has a garden in Crete. She brings three apples to him, and she tells him to drop the apples as he races Atalanta. So he does this, and he wins the race. But in the process, he forgets to thank the goddess Aphrodite. She is thoroughly annoyed, and so she strikes them both with a deep passion for each other. The passion is so strong that they go into a cave dedicated to the goddess Sibyl, the goddess of agriculture, and they basically make wild love in that cave. As a result of that sacrilege, she transforms them into cats, giant lions.
Animals that we love.
Yes, indeed. So, and then they're basically cursed forever to drive Sibyl's chariot, and lions, a bit like bulls in the Mediterranean, are associated with agriculture and virility. So that's where that sort of connection comes.
So it's a story then, when we look at the painting, something kind of key to this story is then lust and desire and yearning, I suppose.
Very much. And kind of tied in with fate as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you can see Atalanta bending down. She's got one of the golden apples in her left hand, and she's bending down, stretching out that right arm to pick up the other one. And yet, for me, if you and I have talked about this, Guido Reni is not my favourite of 17th century painters in Italy. For me, one of the ingredients when I look at this that's missing is a sense of lust. It's a very cool, composed, formal work. That's my kind of modern eye.
Right,
Sure. Contemporaries understand Guido Reni.
It's interesting. I think Guido Reni, and I think it's what's really good is, yes, we come to Guido Reni from this contemporary perspective where a lot of Reni's works are devotional works. They have a lot of religious piety attached to them, not specifically this work. And one reason I chose this work is because it's more of a narrative work. It's perhaps a little more approachable on one level. But on another level, yes, Guido Reni is a painter who employs very cool tones, what we call verdaccio colour. Sort of he builds up the colour in a combination of blacks and terra verte, that's a green earth pigment, and white. And often the warm colours are placed over the top. You get these sort of almost, I like to call them custardy yellows, these sort of creamy yellows and reds. And you get this sort of kind of perhaps sort of austere colouring in his work. And in a way that is probably linked to what he was associated, a real sense of grace. Grace was what Reni was famous for. And some people criticised him that, in a way, the grace of the work sometimes superseded the narrative and the story, that you sort of got caught up in that aspect. And the Roman antiquarian biographer of Reni, Gian Pietro Bellori, criticises him on these grounds. He's saying Reni is this great master. He's one of the most famous painters in Italy. But in a way, perhaps there's a bit too much sort of sprezzatura for sprezzatura's sake. You sort of, if that makes sense, a sort of gracefulness that's sort of dominating the image in the work in a way.
Yeah. It does make sense, because when I look at this work as a composition, I find it extremely elegant. You know, composed is even a word I would use to describe this. In reality, these are people in the midst of a very energetic race, and I see that in their billowing drapery, and yet their bodies are beautifully composed. I can see all of the musculature, which is, I mean, especially on Hippomenes, the light, that contrast between light and shade brings out the form of his body so beautifully. And there's a lovely X shape running through this composition. There is their two bodies as well. So you've touched on this. You've said that Reni was very popular in his own day. So was it that kind of composed classical elegance that people were liking in his style? Is he coming out of that position?
He comes from the Carracci school from Bologna, and in Bologna, a work that greatly influenced that school was Raphael's painting of St. Cecilia, an absolutely exquisite painting. I mean, if you should go to the Pinacoteca in Bologna just to see that. The foreground of the painting, you have St. Cecilia, the patron saint of music. She's surrounded by these other saints. And in the foreground, there is this exquisite, almost quasi-still life of instruments painted. And in the centre, St. Cecilia is looking up to heaven. Her head is tilted to the side. She's staring with her eyes up to heaven. And Reni saw this, and this sort of graceful image really becomes the type that he uses. We actually don't see it really in this painting specifically, but it's that sort of kind of grace as a sort of end in itself that kind of dominates his art. And then it sort of feeds into his devotional works. You'll get lots of works of sort of the death of Lucretia, or paintings of saints, St. Sebastian. Once he returns to Bologna, his famous sort of image of St. Sebastian looking heavenward is born of that. Interestingly, while he's in Rome as a young student, he for a while he dabbles in the style of Caravaggio, which actually gets him into trouble with Caravaggio, who doesn't really like people copying him. Reni is one of those painters who can do other artists extremely well from a young age. He even annoys the Carracci. Annibale Carracci is very upset by how much of a competition he can see Reni will be. And if you go to Bologna again, what you notice with Reni is how effortless he is. He's one of these painters who's incredibly effortless. It's almost like once he hits the maturity in his painting, it all just sort of flows off the brush, almost like a kind of Francois Boucher in the 18th century, or we might think of Luca Giordano in the later 17th century. It's just one of those painters who's very effortless, and I think that's another appeal of his work. There's also, he comes in contact in Rome with a series of sculptures called the Niobe Sculpture Group. This is the story of Niobe, who offends the mother of Apollo and Diana, and as a result, she's put to death. Apollo and Diana come after her and her children, and they're all slaughtered. And there's a wonderful, you can see it in the Uffizi, this beautiful figure of Niobe looking over her shoulders in a state of terror. But there's actually quite a few versions. There's another version in Crete which looks a bit more naturalistic. But the version we have in the Uffizi, Reni saw it when it was in Rome. And the face is sort of quite puffy, and she's sort of really looking up in a slightly almost abstract way. It's almost not even quite natural. And what Reni sort of does is he absorbs that kind of graceful abstraction from the Niobe, much as he had from Raphael's St. Cecilia. And those qualities are sort of integrated into his work. And I think that's something we find hard perhaps today to connect with the average person, because they tend to relate to a very religious setting in a lot of his work.
Yeah, that kind of tough problem, I suppose, of the period eye, that you always look with your own sense of criteria for aesthetics and beliefs.
And in a way, the limitations of visual analysis on that regard, as important as visual analysis is for art historians, I think it's also so important to read the literature of the period so that we bring those kind of conceptions to the artworks themselves. I mean, one thing that is interesting, I mean, Reni, another pupil of the Carracci Domenichino, was praised for his skill with the affetti. The affetti is an Italian word where we get the word in English affection from. It's kind of like embodied cognition, the idea where the emotions are expressed and the intentions are sort of shown in the gesticulations of the hands. And actually, there are aspects of this work that allow us to enter into that. And I think if we look at Hippomenes, the way his hand is directed away from the apple that he's dropped, while he lunges forward, the way she reaches forward to grab the fruit while holding the other. And then in a way, what's interesting in Ovid's account, she is described, she's running naked, very unusual for Greeks. The only Greeks who did that were the Spartans. But she is described as having tassels attached to her legs, streamers. And what Reni has done, he's used this sort of serpentine drapery, which in a way isn't keeping with Ovid, but it's a sort of way of emphasizing again the action, the affetti, the way the body is lunged one way and the other body is lunged in the other.
And such a beautiful contrast with the harder kind of more straight diagonal lines formed by the limbs, the long limbs from their shoulders through to their feet. So one thing I do really enjoy about Reni is how carefully he balances all of those different kinds of considerations. And you've said to us that in his own time, he's respected, he's commercially successful. He travels the length of Italy at that time, and per square inch is paid more than any other artist at his time. So he's really successful artist in the 17th century in Italy. What happens to his reputation after his own time? How is he perceived moving through to our own time?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, one of the most interesting stories about that is the Victorian art critic John Ruskin, who castigates Charles Eastlake, the first director of the National Gallery, for purchasing actually what I think is an actually beautiful Reni, which is a painting called Lot and His Daughters. It's a story of Lot having left Sodom.
None of these stories are good stories. None of them end well.
And yet his two daughters who end up having incest with their father. But it's actually, again, the affetti. If you look at the hand gestures, they're quite beautifully composed one against the other. But what Eastlake was actually famous for was introducing the British public to Quattrocento art and the early Renaissance. So he goes to Europe and starts collecting up Northern European paintings as well and Quattrocento paintings, and brings them back, and they become part of the National Gallery collection. So really through Eastlake we get quite a new direction. And in a way what sort of happens is almost as early Renaissance painting comes into fashion, and in a way it's sort of simplicity and it's sort of stillness, that sort of kind of coincides with Bolognese painting kind of starting to kind of incrementally go out of fashion. Also linked to the fact that these artists, and we'll probably discuss this more in a future talk on Barocci, issues of eclecticism. The Romantics have this view that artists that take things from multiple sources, that's not the individual.
It's not pure.
Yeah, it's not pure. It's not pure. The pure genius speaking. Exactly. Yeah.
I really, just as we move to our conclusion, I've really appreciated what you've brought out about, I guess, what we might call in English as well, affect. This idea that you can kind of perform in your body something that gives a person an emotional reading or a psychological reading on you. And I find it interesting that in more recent times, Reni has really appealed as an artist to people like, the Japanese cultural figure and failed politician Mishima, for example, that there's a kind of an affect that can allow you to perform something else, so that the idea that we can read through the bodies and gestures in this scene, something that tells us about what's going on within these people and how these people are kind of fated really to come together. It's been a very interesting reading of the painting. Thanks so much for coming in today.
You're most welcome, Kathleen. Thank you very much. Thank you.
You've been listening to Limelight Arts Travels podcast, A Closer Look. It was recorded on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and we acknowledge and pay our respects to the traditional custodians of this land and their elders past and present.